The woman in seat 19C had been silent the entire flight, reading a worn paperback about mountain climbing and sipping water, never once looking up or making eye contact with anyone around her. She wore a simple black t-shirt and cargo pants with hiking boots, her auburn hair tied back in a practical braid, and everything about her screamed ordinary traveler on a budget airline flight from Seattle to San Diego. Nobody noticed her, nobody spoke to her, and that was exactly how Lieutenant Commander Rachel Phoenix Morrison liked it after 12 years of being noticed, being talked about, being the woman who had done things that most people thought were impossible. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. She had left the Navy 6 months ago after a career that included flying F/A-18 Super Hornets off carriers, leading strike missions over hostile territory, and training the next generation of fighter pilots at Top Gun. Her call sign Phoenix had been earned after she brought back a damaged aircraft that everyone else thought was going down, nursed at home on one engine and pure determination, and the name stuck because she always rose from situations that should have killed her. But she was done with all that now, done with the pressure and the danger and the weight of being a legend, and all she wanted was to get to San Diego quietly and start her new job as a civilian flight instructor teaching rich kids how to fly Cessnas. The flight was half empty on this Tuesday afternoon, mostly business travelers and a few families, and Rachel was grateful for the empty seat next to her that gave her space to think. She was on page 63 of her book when she heard raised voices from the front of the cabin, angry shouting that made her look up with the instincts of someone trained to recognize danger. A flight attendant was backing away from a large man in the first-class section, and Rachel could see the wild look in the man's eyes that said he was either drunk or high or mentally unstable, probably all three. The man was yelling about the government and conspiracies and how he was going to show them all, and Rachel saw him pull something from his jacket that looked like a weapon. People started screaming and the flight attendant stumbled backward, and then another man stood up from seat 3B, a huge guy with a shaved head and the kind of bearing that screamed military even in civilian clothes. He moved toward the threat with the confidence of someone who had faced worse, and Rachel recognized the walk, the posture, the calm in the storm that could only belong to a SEAL or someone from that world. The SEAL moved fast, grabbing the weapon which turned out to be a gun, and there was a brief struggle that ended with the SEAL disarming the man and putting him in a chokehold that dropped him unconscious in about 5 seconds. Rachel relaxed slightly, thinking the crisis was over, but then she heard something that made her blood run cold. A gunshot, loud and sharp, and the aircraft lurched violently as depressurization alarms started screaming and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Rachel's training kicked in immediately and she saw what had happened. The gun had discharged during the struggle and the bullet had punched through the cockpit door, and now the aircraft was diving and the screaming got louder and people were panicking. The SEAL was shouting for everyone to stay calm and put on their oxygen masks, his voice cutting through the chaos with command authority, but Rachel was already unbuckling and moving forward because she knew what a diving aircraft meant and she knew they had seconds not minutes to fix this. She pushed past panicked passengers and reached the front galley where the SEAL was trying to get the cockpit door open, but it was locked and reinforced and nobody was answering from inside. The SEAL looked at her and said, "I need to get in there, the pilots might be hit," and Rachel said, "Step back," and she kicked the door handle with her boot heel in exactly the right spot, the weak point that she had been briefed on during her carrier training, and the lock mechanism broke and the door swung open. What they saw inside made Rachel's stomach drop. The captain was slumped over the controls with blood on his shoulder, hit by the bullet that had come through the door, and the first officer was unconscious in the right seat, his head bleeding where it had hit the instrument panel when the captain's body had pushed the yoke forward. The aircraft was in a steep dive, the altimeter unwinding fast, and through the windscreen Rachel could see the Pacific Ocean coming up at a speed that would kill everyone on board in about 45 seconds. The SEAL looked at the scene and then looked at Rachel and his eyes went wide because he recognized something in her face, the calm in the crisis, the way she was already calculating solutions instead of freezing in fear. He said, "Can you fly?" And Rachel said, "Yes," and he said, "Can you fly this?" And she said, "I can fly anything," and he grabbed her and physically threw her into the captain's seat while he pulled the unconscious captain out and dropped him on the cockpit floor. Rachel's hands hit the controls and muscle memory took over. She pulled back on the yoke and felt the aircraft resist because it was going too fast and the angle was too steep, but she knew how to fight an aircraft that didn't want to cooperate. She pulled harder and adjusted the trim and slowly, painfully slowly, the nose started to come up. The ocean was 500 feet below them and closing fast, but the dive was starting to flatten and she could feel the aircraft responding to her inputs. 300 feet and still diving, but the rate was decreasing. 200 feet and the nose was almost level. 100 feet and she could see individual waves and the aircraft shuddered as it pulled out of the dive. and then they were climbing again at 50 feet above the water, and everyone on board who could see out the windows was screaming or crying or praying. Rachel leveled off at 2,000 feet and took her first breath, her hands shaking on the controls but her mind absolutely clear because this was what she had trained for, this was what she had done 1,000 times in simulators and in combat, and the only difference was the size of the aircraft and the number of lives depending on her. The SEAL was standing behind her and he said, "Holy hell, who are you?" And Rachel said, "Someone who needs you to check on those pilots, find out how bad they're hurt, and then I need you to help me figure out how to land this thing." He moved immediately, checking the captain who was conscious but in shock from a shoulder wound, and the first officer who was coming around with a bad concussion. The SEAL looked at Rachel and said, "Captain stable but can't fly, first officer is barely conscious, you're all we've got." Rachel said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Captain Jake Morrison, Navy SEALs, and before you ask, yes, I know how to follow orders from a pilot because I've done enough hello insertions to know when someone knows what they're doing." Rachel almost smiled and said, "Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morrison, Navy retired, call sign Phoenix, and I'm going to need you to be my co-pilot because I can't do this alone." Jake's eyes went wide and he said, "You're Phoenix, the Phoenix from the Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, the one who flew that damaged Hornet back from Syria with one engine and no hydraulics?" And Rachel said, "That was a long time ago and right now I need you to focus, sit in that right seat and do exactly what I tell you." He moved to the first officer's seat and Rachel started talking him through the basics, showing him what each instrument meant and what each control did, and she was impressed by how fast he learned because SEALs were trained to adapt and this was just another hostile environment requiring immediate mastery. She got on the radio and declared an emergency, told air traffic control they had wounded pilots and a passenger flying the aircraft and needed priority handling to the nearest suitable airport. The controller's voice came back shaky, asking for her qualifications, and Rachel said, "Phoenix 17, former F/A-18 pilot, 3,000 hours, I can handle this but I need vectors to a long runway and emergency services standing by." The controller's voice changed completely when he heard her call sign because even civilian controllers knew the legends, and he said, "Phoenix, we have you, San Diego is 40 miles ahead, runway 27 is being cleared, fire trucks are rolling, you're cleared direct." Rachel flew the approach manually because the autopilot had been damaged in the dive and she didn't trust it anyway, she preferred to fly by feel and instinct. She talked Jake through the landing checklist, having him call out items while she configured the aircraft, extending flaps and gear and running through the procedures that would get them on the ground safely. The passengers were quiet now, the ones who could see into the cockpit were watching this woman and this SEAL working together with absolute focus, and word was spreading through the cabin that Phoenix was flying them. The legendary Navy pilot was at the controls. Jake said, "How many times have you landed a 737? And Rachel said, "This is my first time," and Jake said, "You're kidding?" And Rachel said, "Nope, but I've landed F-18s on carriers at night in bad weather with battle damage. This is just a bigger aircraft with more runway, the physics are the same, trust the process." Jake laughed, a short bark of disbelief and respect, and said, "SEALs and fighter pilots, same breed of crazy, let's do this." The runway appeared ahead and Rachel lined up perfectly, her hands making tiny adjustments to keep them on the center line. She was high and fast but that was intentional, better to have energy you could bleed off than to be low and slow with no options. She crossed the threshold and pulled the throttles to idle, let the aircraft sink toward the runway, and at exactly the right moment she flared, raising the nose and letting the main gear kiss the concrete with barely a bump. The passengers erupted in cheers and applause as Rachel deployed the thrust reversers and brakes, bringing the big aircraft to a smooth stop with half the runway still ahead of them. She set the parking brake and secured the engines, then sat back and let out a long breath. Jake was staring at her with something like awe and said, "That was the smoothest landing I've ever felt on a commercial aircraft," and Rachel said, "Carrier landings make you good at precision, you either hit your mark or you go swimming." The emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and paramedics rushed aboard to treat the wounded pilots. Rachel helped coordinate the passenger evacuation, making sure everyone got off safely, and she worked with Jake to give statements to the FBI agents who had arrived to investigate the shooting. The news media had gotten wind of the story and reporters were gathering at the airport, all wanting to talk to the mysterious woman who had landed the aircraft. Rachel tried to slip away but Jake caught her arm and said, "Hey, you can't just disappear, people need to know what you did," and Rachel said, "I just flew an airplane, that's all, I don't need recognition for doing what any pilot should be able to do in an emergency." Jake shook his head and said, "That's not what happened and you know it, you saved 147 lives today, you took control of a dying aircraft and brought it back from the edge, that's not just flying, that's being a warrior." A reporter spotted them and rushed over with a camera crew, asking, "Are you the pilot, are you the person who landed the plane?" And Rachel said, I was just a passenger who happened to know how to fly. The real heroes are Captain Morrison and the crew who kept everyone calm. But Jake stepped in front of the camera and said, this is Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morrison, call sign Phoenix, Navy fighter pilot retired, and she just pulled off one of the most incredible emergency landings I've ever witnessed. She took a damaged aircraft in a dive and brought it back, then landed it like she's been flying 737s her whole life. The reporter's eyes went wide and she said, Phoenix, the Phoenix who flew the damaged Hornet back from Syria? And Rachel sighed and said, yes, that was me, but this isn't about old stories, this is about making sure those pilots get the medical care they need and making sure these passengers get home to their families. She tried to walk away but Jake grabbed her shoulder and said, why are you running from this? Why won't you accept that you're a hero? Rachel turned and looked at him with tired eyes and said, because I've been called a hero too many times and I've seen too many real heroes die. I'm just someone who was in the right place with the right skills at the right time. That doesn't make me special, it makes me lucky. Jake said, it makes you both, and people need to know that there are still people like you out there, people who step up when everything goes wrong. Over the next few days the story spread across the country. The woman in seat 19C who had been silent until a SEAL captain shouted, who can fly this bird? And she had stepped forward and saved everyone. Rachel gave a few interviews reluctantly, always deflecting credit to Jake and the crew and the passengers who stayed calm. She told the story simply, explaining what happened and what she did, never making it sound dramatic or heroic, just a technical problem that required a technical solution. But Jake was telling a different story to anyone who would listen, describing the way Rachel had taken control with absolute confidence, the way she had flown the aircraft with precision that shouldn't have been possible for someone who had never touched a 737 before, the way she had landed them so smoothly that people applauded. He did interviews saying, I've worked with the best warriors in the world, SEALs and fighter pilots and special operators, and Phoenix is one of the best I've ever seen. The way she handled that emergency was textbook perfection but also pure instinct and skill. 2 weeks later Rachel was at a coffee shop in San Diego trying to enjoy some quiet time when Jake walked in and spotted her. He came over and said, mind if I sit? And Rachel gestured to the empty chair. He sat down and said, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. You saved my life along with everyone else on that plane. Rachel said, you saved everyone first by stopping that guy before he could hurt more people. I just flew the plane afterward. Jake said, I've been thinking about something about why you left the Navy, about why someone with your skills would walk away from flying fighters to teach Cessnas to rich kids. Rachel looked at him and said, how do you know about that? And Jake said, I did some research, talked to some people, I'm a SEAL, we're good at finding information. Rachel sighed and said, I left because I was tired of war and tired of being Phoenix, tired of people expecting me to be perfect all the time. Jake nodded and said, I get that, I've been there, the weight of the reputation gets heavy after a while, but here's the thing, you can't stop being who you are. You proved that on that aircraft. The moment the crisis hit you became Phoenix again whether you wanted to or not. Rachel said, that was different, people needed help and I had the skills to help them. And Jake said, exactly, and people are always going to need help and you're always going to have the skills to help them, so the question is what are you going to do about it? Rachel said, what are you suggesting? And Jake leaned forward and said, I'm suggesting you stop hiding, stop pretending you're just another pilot, and start using your skills to train the next generation properly, not rich kids in Cessnas but real pilots who might face real emergencies. Teach them what you know, pass on the skills that saved 147 lives 2 weeks ago. Rachel thought about that and said, who would I teach, where would I do this? Jake said, I have connections with a private training company that works with commercial airlines, they teach crisis management and emergency procedures, they could use someone with your experience, someone who's actually been there and done it for real. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her saying, think about it, but don't think too long, the world needs more people like you teaching the next generation how to be ready for anything. Rachel took the card and looked at it, seeing the company name and contact information, and she thought about what Jake had said. She thought about the moment on that aircraft when she had taken control and everything had clicked into place, when all her training and experience had come together to solve an impossible problem. She thought about the passengers who were alive because she had been in seat 19C that day, and she thought about how many more people could be saved if she taught other pilots how to handle emergencies the way she had. She looked at Jake and said, you know what, you're right, I can't stop being Phoenix and maybe I shouldn't try to, maybe instead I should accept it and use it to make things better. Jake smiled and said, now you're talking, the world needs warriors who know how to teach, who can pass on the skills that save lives, that's the real heroism, not just doing it yourself but teaching others how to do it too. 3 months later Rachel was standing in a simulator facility with a class of commercial pilots, putting them through emergency scenarios that tested their skills and decision-making. She was teaching them the same lessons she had learned in Fighters and Carriers, about staying calm under pressure, about using every resource available, about never giving up even when the situation looked hopeless. And she was using the story of the Seattle to San Diego flight as a teaching tool, breaking down every decision she made and why she made it, showing them how to think like a fighter pilot even when flying a commercial aircraft. Jake visited sometimes, sitting in on the classes and adding his perspective as someone who had been there, describing what it looked like from the other seat when Phoenix took control. The students were learning from two warriors, a fighter pilot and a SEAL, and they were getting an education that no regular training program could provide. One day after class, a young pilot came up to Rachel and said, "I just want to say thank you. Before this course I was scared of emergencies, scared I wouldn't know what to do, but you've shown me that with the right training and the right mindset, I can handle anything." Rachel smiled and said, "That's exactly right. Fear is natural, but training beats fear every time. You just have to be ready." The student left and Jake walked up and said, "You're doing good work here, Phoenix. These pilots are learning from the best." And Rachel said, "I'm learning too, learning that teaching might be more important than doing, because if I can train 10 pilots to handle emergencies, that's 10 times more lives that might be saved down the road." Jake nodded and said, "That's the warrior's journey. First you learn to fight, then you learn to lead, then you learn to teach, and teaching is the hardest and most important of all." Rachel thought about the woman she had been in seat 19C, silent and trying to disappear, trying to leave Phoenix behind and become someone ordinary. She thought about how impossible that had been, how the moment of crisis had revealed that she could never be ordinary because her skills and experience were too valuable to hide. She thought about all the students she was training and all the lives they might save someday because of what she taught them. And she realized that Jake had been right. Being Phoenix wasn't a burden she had to carry alone, it was a gift she could share with others, a legacy she could pass on to make sure that when the next crisis came, there would be people ready to handle it. She wasn't running from who she was anymore, she was embracing it and using it to make the world safer, and that felt better than anything she had done in a long time. The woman in seat 19C had been silent, but Phoenix would never be silent again, not when she had so much to teach and so many lives to protect. And somewhere out there, pilots were flying with her lessons in their heads, ready for the moment when everything would go wrong and they would have to step up, just like she had done, just like warriors always did when people needed them most.